All right. Good afternoon, everyone. It is Monday, April 8th, 2019 at 2 o'clock Eastern Time, and this is Admissions Live. I'm your guest host, Gil Rogers, and on today's live broadcast, we'll be talking with Kevin Crockett, Senior Executive at R&L, about yield strategies pre and post May 1. Admissions Live is part of the Higher Ed Live network. All of our episodes offer you direct access to the best and brightest minds in education. Be a part of our live broadcast by sharing your knowledge. Participate in today's discussion by tweeting us using hashtag HigherEdLive. Today's live broadcast is powered by Platform Q Education's Conduit online engagement platform. Learn how to integrate continuous online engagement into your marketing enrollment plans through Conduit, visiting platformqedu.com. All of our episodes are recorded. They're free and easy to access in the video archives at higheredlive.com, or take Higher Ed Live with you on the go by subscribing to the podcast. Are you a marketing or communication professional who works in your institution's website? M. Stoner's Advanced Marketing for Higher Education course is now available on demand and has something for everyone, especially those of you who may wear many hats. You'll walk away better understanding your key audiences, how to create exceptional content with better planning, how to move your website from a capital project to an ongoing process, and more. We'll be tweeting out a link to learn more about the on-demand course shortly. So now that we're done through the Gil's reading lesson part of the day, I want to circle back, introduce our guest today, Kevin Crockett, who's a senior executive at R&L. I've had the opportunity to run into Kevin at the last few conferences over the past few months. We're looking forward today to talking about what institutions can do between now, May 1st, and beyond to influence yield for their incoming class and future classes. But before we get started, Kevin, I would love to hear a little bit about your story, your experiences, how you got where you are, and then we can kind of jump into the topic from there.
Great. Thanks, Gil. Good afternoon, everybody. Kevin Crockett. I'm a senior executive with Ruffalo Noah Levitz. For those of you that I haven't had a chance to meet over the years, I've been in this business for going on 35 years now. I kind of grew up in the business, actually. My father was vice president of the American College Testing Program, and I grew up in Iowa City where their national headquarters were. So the fact they ended up in enrollment work is kind of interesting. And in my case, the apple didn't fall very far from the tree. But I did my undergraduate work at Trinity University and was one of those students who gave tours and stuffed envelopes and made phone calls and visited my high school at Christmas. And although as a political science and communications major, the big plan was to head to Washington after I graduated and work in Washington, D.C. As probably a congressional aide. But as fate would have it, we lost an election on a November night in 1986, which kind of scuttled those plans. And so I ended up back in admissions at Cornell College in Iowa. Got hired by a guy named Peter Bryant, who was many of you probably know, was a mentor of mine. And worked for Peter and then eventually became chief enrollment officer at Cornell. So I was there from 87 to 1995, at which point I joined Noah Levitz on a full-time basis, or what was then Noah Levitz, and started out in our financial aid practice and our management consulting practice, and eventually became president of what was then Noah Levitz from 2003 to 2014, at which point we merged into kind of the Ruffalo Noah Levitz, or the R&L organization. And since that time, I've done a couple of things. I ran an enrollment division for about a year and a half, but our intentions always were to kind of collapse our divisions. We got that done, at which point I have been spending most of my time for the last year and a half or so back out in the field working with our campus partners and prospective partners, and that's always been my first love throughout my time in this industry. I've always spent a ton of time on campus helping them to problem solve, and so I'm back doing what I love. So it's good to be here this afternoon, and hopefully we can have a fruitful discussion about yield.
Awesome. Yeah. And thank you, Kevin, for joining us today. Really appreciate it. I know you're busy most of the time on airplanes and campuses. So I'm glad you're able to take some time to join us. So, like you mentioned, the topic is yield, right? You've got tons of experience on campuses, talking to institutions about where their strategies are at, what pain points they're experiencing, particularly at this time of year. What are you seeing kind of at a high level as far as yield from, and for those who might be joining the webcast, the presentation from other offices around campus, when we're talking about yield in this context, it's students who are offered admission to the institution who end up enrolling at the campus, right? So the higher that number is, the more selective you can be, the more and the better fiscal health of the institution, all that sort of stuff, right? So would love kind of your thoughts on overall what we're experiencing, what we're seeing with respect to yield today versus maybe the past 5-10 years before.
Yeah, well, it's an interesting topic, and it's one that's, I think, been I don't want to say perplexing, but an issue that chief enrollment officers are dealing with. But also, I hear a lot of conversation from CFOs wondering what's going on, because the truth of the matter is there's been quite a bit of volatility in yield rates over the last decade. I would say really since the onset of the Great Recession in 2008, 2009. Interjected some sort of additional financial uncertainties into the system, and since then there's been again a fair amount of volatility, but also just on a normative national basis, what we've seen is a pretty significant decline in the average yield rate. So every 2 years, R&L sponsors the admissions funnel benchmark reports, which some of you may have accessed on our website. But what that shows is that since 2009. Private yield rates at private four-year institutions have declined from an average of 29%. Again, Gil, to your point, that's the percentage of admitted students who enroll. So it was 29% in 2009. That's down to 22% now in the private sector by 2016, 2017, and we're about to release the fall 2018 data here fairly shortly. So this is about a year and a half old. And I would expect it to erode a little bit more. And by the way, just kind of going back, if we went back prior to 2009 and went back into the early 2000s when we first started doing that poll, we would have seen private college yields in the kind of high 30s to low 40s. So really this current 22% average rate, has come down from 29 in 2009. But if we pushed it back another decade or so, we'd be looking at rates in the high 30s, low 40s. So really pretty substantial change. And then on the public university side, the decline's been even steeper, at least since 2009, and it was at 43% of again admitted students enrolling at four-year publics in 2009, and we were down to 27% in our most recent poll. And again, if you took that data back even farther, you'd find rates that were in the upper 40s, approaching 50%. So yields have been in decline for quite some time. There's a lot of reasons for that. I think most people know students are applying to more colleges, so that's a factor. We've seen the average number of schools a student applies to gradually increase. Certainly, as things like the Common App have grown, that has caused, I think, or provided students with an easier opportunity to apply to multiple places, which is going to inherently push down yield. And then I would contend that a lot of the kind of financial pressures we're facing in our industry right now are causing volatility in yield rates as well. In other words, what we're seeing is student borrowing, despite what the media reports, actually coming down a little bit, so less willingness to borrow. We're seeing gaps steadily increase, financial aid gaps. And so as students make that all-important decision about where to enroll, often financing plays a big part of that. And there's just been a lot of uncertainty in the financial system, particularly for the last 4 to 5 years. So I think all that, and of course now we're in a fairly stable to declining pool of students, depending on what part of the country you're in. So you put all those things together, you end up with a lot more volatility from accept to enroll than maybe it was 10, 15, 20 years ago. When I first got into business, it was fairly common for a school to have a relatively stable yield rate, which allowed you to predict with a fair amount of certainty year to year how many students you were likely to enroll based on how many admitted. Now it's not uncommon for us to see schools that might experience 2, 3, 4, 5 points of variation in yield from one year to the next. And, if you're dealing with thousands of admits, every point's 10 students per 1,000, right? And so all of a sudden you can miss a class by 20, 30, 40, 50 students if you don't have a good handle on kind of what's likely to happen to your admitted population. So I think it's a really smart topic for us to be talking about right now. And again, I know it's one that's got the attention of not only chief enrollment officers, but provosts and CFOs and the like. Yeah,
those are great points. And I think one of the things that I hear a lot here at Platform Q when we're talking to institutions is it's a conversion issue, right? Like if you have a softer pool at the top of the funnel, then your number at the bottom is going to decline because you're pursuing the wrong students because you're not identifying the right students at the top of the funnel, which we'll talk about in a little bit about future strategies. Or you're not maintaining a strong enough connection with them throughout the process. If you're relying on what you were doing by itself 15, 20 years ago without anything layered on top of it. I was at the R&L Strategic Enrollment Planning Forum a couple weeks ago in Chicago. And one of the things that was brought up during the best practices in recruitment session was, it's not an either or, it's an and when it comes to a lot of strategies, right? You didn't stop emailing students when you started doing digital marketing, right? The more items that you layer on top of strategies, the more you're going to have the opportunity to boost conversion, whether that's increasing inquiry to applicant conversion or complete application completion, or at the bottom of the funnel yield, right? So it's about kind of looking through that whole process from top to bottom, because I've heard many institutions that they miss their application number because of whatever the volatility at the top, soft lists, et cetera. So then the way they're going to offset that is by boosting yield at the bottom. But it's hard to do that once your bed's already been made with a soft pool of inquiries, right? So it's making sure that we're being as strategic as we can. So with all of that in mind, and all that additional color, given your background, your experience, all the institutions you've worked with, how realistic is it to think that things that a school does today, they had a magic wand and could start new strategies today? How can they really influence a student's final decision? Or is that bed made and they're still and they need to move on to the next class and kind of cut their losses?
Yeah, I think it's a good question. I guess one thing I would add to your comments, Gil, is that I think you're spot on in the sense that in addition to forces like the Common Application, which I think is now approaching 800 members or something in that general ballpark, there's also been kind of a movement generally and among at least a set of schools to sort of continue to streamline application processes. So we've seen the elimination of lots of things, essays and recommendations, and schools making it much easier for students to apply. And sometimes I think that gets overcooked to the extreme, where what you end up with is not really an applicant/admitted student. You're really dealing with something that looks more like a qualified inquiry in terms of interest, and that also I think has had an effect on these declining yield rates that we were talking about earlier. So I couldn't agree with you more there. With respect to sort of how much control we have over yield at this point, I think that depends a lot on kind of who you are. There's still a whole big group of schools out there that are largely what I would call May 1 places, meaning the vast majority of their students are going to respect the kind of May 1 national candidate reply date. And historically, they don't see a lot of activity post, kind of May 10, May 15th. Things dry up pretty quickly. Their students either confirm, deposit, or they don't. And of the remaining portions of the pool, there's not much of that pool that's still accessible. Meaning they've made decisions to go other places, and perhaps all they can affect, on an ongoing basis is their transfer numbers, and certainly the ability to also affect their summer melt. That is the proportion of those kind of shortly after May 1 deposits that end up enrolling. So, if you're one of those places historically, typically those are a little bit more selective schools that attract a little bit higher calibers of students. Your window is pretty narrow right now. You're looking at we're 2-3 weeks out now from that critical date, and the ability to impact it literally is a 1-month exercise at this juncture, or a 3-month exercise. On the other hand, I would say a growing number of schools, and we see this from the NACAC survey and so on. There are a growing number of schools out there, given the current kind of market forces and challenges, that are pretty much in a process that's going to require them to recruit all the way through the summer, or at least until early August. Frankly, although we see schools recruiting right up until the end, we often see that adversely affects retention, by the way, when you get students who are committing very late and don't have the opportunity to settle financially and make good choices around classes and so on. But if you're one of those places that typically recruits well into June and July, substantially for your freshmen, and maybe all the way into August for your transfer market, then obviously you've still got room to have an impact on what your new student enrollment looks like next fall. So I think the answer to that question is sort of, it depends on your context, your selectivity, and the behavior of students in your market. And I guess the final point I would make about that is that, it feels like out there's more and more students who don't necessarily feel like they're bound by that sort of old May 1 can or reply date, that they kind of have a pretty good sense that they'll have choices after May 1, and only the most selective schools are likely to pull their offers of admission if they haven't made a commitment. So again, that's just one you've got to monitor in your own marketplace. So I don't know, did you want to talk a little bit about like what schools can still be doing right now to affect yield for fall? Is that a good time?
Yeah, I think that's a great place
to go next.
Great transition, right? I think there's a good opportunity here to say, let's say you can, right? Which I think for many institutions, we talked earlier late last week about, with May 1, it used to be May 1 is the finish line. Now it's a mile marker, right? And there's a lot of opportunity for many institutions to do more through the admissions office, but then also throughout the summer with, there comes a point when admissions needs to be able to hand off the class to the rest of the community, the campus community, and start working on the next one. But we know realistically that many admissions offices are kind of on the hook until census date, right? So
Right.
How can they, what are some thoughts on things that schools can do today that could help to influence the yield for the class ahead of May 1st? And then maybe we could talk a little bit about post May 1 to the extent that they can be involved or support the rest of the campus, make sure summer melt doesn't creep in.
Right. Okay. So yeah, let's start with just sort of how can we still turn admitted students into confirmed students? And so for some of you, a confirmation is a deposit. For others of you, a confirmation is a registration. So not everybody, I realize, on the cast today would necessarily have an enrollment deposit. Kind of depends on your context. So I don't think any of this is going to be breakthrough, but maybe this will serve as a breakthrough thinking. Maybe it will serve as a good reminder of some basic fundamental things that affect ultimately the student decisions to enroll. And so I'll just kind of tick off some things that I see working out there, or that I see schools focusing on at this point in time. I mean, obviously, managing the kind of financial aid award and any potential appeals or adjustments to that award is really critical. We are big believers at R&L that depending on, for those of you with smaller admitted populations, when I say that, maybe less than 3,000, 4,000, or 5,000, we'd expect you to be able to, or we would hope that a school could do a good job of coding a student's likelihood to enroll based upon their last interaction with the family. And that interaction could happen face-to-face, via the telephone, via email exchanges, text exchanges, any number of ways, but also understanding then how they're reacting to their financial aid award. And, we've had financial aid awards in the marketplace now since last November for many schools. And so really understanding who's deciding on money and deciding who wants to be at your school, and to the extent that there's any kind of final gap that has to be closed, and depending on what your willingness to do that is, but really aggressively making sure that people who want to be at your school, you're doing everything that you can to help them make that as affordable as possible. And that would be up to and including things like professional judgment, right? When we've got families who have had changes in financial circumstances, and being pretty quick to respond to that. So I would say aggressive financial aid case management would be among the first things that I'd be paying attention to right now. In other words, are there a subset of your students who really want your campus right now, but haven't, but are having difficulty trying to figure out how to make that affordable? And are you doing everything in your power to help them with that process? I think the second thing I'd be working on, and I think this is a bit of a lost art, but I call it really aggressive case management. So I just mentioned we want to understand, from a student's perspective, what their likelihood to enroll is. We want to understand how they're responding to the financial aid award, but we also want to make sure we're documenting and responding to their dominant buying motive. Are their final 2 or 3 or 1 choice factors that are going to really make the difference, and how effectively are we at making sure that we're getting them information on that choice factor? I often say that, an admissions counselor is really an information broker. And if you look at most of the kind of survey data, or if you look at admitted student data, questionnaire data for many schools, what you'll find is the admissions counselor isn't viewed as a really important source of information about the college choice, but what they are is considered a very valuable resource in terms of getting the information to the student, whether that be talking to a faculty member in their field of interest, or visiting with an athletic coach in a smaller college context, or engaging with a student around other extracurricular, co-curricular buying motives, or dealing with location issues, be those advantages or disadvantages. So I think really understanding what's on the student's mind, what's going to drive choice, and having a strategy on that. I was at a campus recently and was observing a admission staff meeting, and they were literally going through with the admission staff a list of their pending admits, and they were requiring each admissions representative to talk about what their kind of case management strategy, what was the next step they were going to work with that particular student on to try to kind of close the deal. So I don't think we always do that super great, and I think it's something we can all be better at. Visits, obviously, really hard to enroll a student if they haven't visited. I think that's kind of self-evident. So obviously really understanding what portions of your admitted population have not yet had a chance to visit, and trying to make that a key next step or call to action, be that in the next 4 weeks for UMA1 places, but certainly over the summer for others. Nationally, we're at about 1 out of 4. It takes about 4 unique visitors to enroll a student at the typical private college, and that rate jumps into the low to mid 30s for public universities, right? So literally for every 100 freshmen you want to enroll at a private college, you need about 400 unique visitors to enroll 100, and in a public university you need about 300-ish to enroll 100 unique visitors. So really managing those visit numbers and understanding what it takes at your school to enroll a unique visitor. When I say unique visitor, somebody who's visited campus in any way, and whether they visited once or multiple times, just understanding that if I want 1,000 freshmen and I have a 25% unique visitor enroll rate, then I probably need 4,000 unique visitors in a cycle, right? And some of those visits will occur post-admit, others will occur earlier in the process. So visits. I would push outcomes really strongly right now. 2019 grads have probably got all kinds of great opportunities lined up, and I think it's a wonderful time of year to highlight some of the things that they're doing, whether it's graduate schools that they've gotten into or jobs that they've already secured with high-profile employers. So I would be thinking about that. Think extreme personalization right now with heavy emotional appeals. I'm always quick to remind folks that we know through research that when students are making their initial final decision, let's call it that, to enroll at a college, that's that initial confirmation, whether they're going to deposit or register, whatever, it tends to be a fairly emotional decision, actually. So think the student just says, I visited and it felt right there. I felt most comfortable there. Pretty emotional. We'll talk in a minute about once they deposit what happens, and then what happens is they kind of flip back and they get pretty logical pretty quickly. But anything you can do to kind of reach to them emotionally through personal contacts from current students, staff, faculty, et cetera, can be really important. And to that end, I think connecting prospective students with current students through digital channels, through personal handwritten notes, through the occasional phone call, through text messaging, but really having a chance to connect current students to prospective students and mid students at this point is important. And then I guess the final point I'd make is I see a lot of schools that sell their academic programs pretty hard, the student's intended academic program, early in the college selection process. Like that's a really rational reason that students often apply to school, because they perceive that that there's a program that's of high quality and that will meet their needs. And then they tend to sometimes back off that messaging post-accept, or they leave it to the department or the program, and that can be sometimes risky if you don't have evenness in how aggressively your colleges or schools or programs are actually following up on admitted students. So really re-reminding them about the strength of their specific academic program, I think, is a really important set of messages this time of the year. So those are just some initial thoughts on things that you can be doing right now to still affect 2019 class.
Awesome. Yeah. So a couple of things that really pop out to me from what you were talking about is, one is the financial aid piece. And one of the things we see a lot are institutions hosting, an an online event specifically focused on how to understand your financial aid package, right? Because that's something that, especially for first generation students or even students whose parents have been through the process, it can still be consuming and tedious and a hard to understand process. What's the difference between a grant and a loan? What's the difference between all these different things, right? So helping students get access to that information live and on demand are great ways to make sure that, and it's not just a long list of bullet points on your website because nobody reads, right? So it's having that information available and accessible when those packages go. And the other that you mentioned too, and we actually have a question that came in via Twitter that I'll throw out. If you have other questions, Twitter sphere, feel free to use the hashtag #HigherEdLive and we'll answer them. But you mentioned that admissions counselors might not necessarily as individual people be the most important to a student, but when you really think about it, they're the ones that enable the student to connect with faculty, to answer questions about financial aid, to schedule that overnight host visit, whatever it is. They're the ones who are, for lack of a better term, the conduit that makes those things happen, right? So they are able to help.
That was exactly the point I was trying to make, is that prospective families know that their job is to try to persuade them to come to the school. So they're not viewed quite as credibly as a source of information, but they're viewed as an absolutely essential channel for getting maybe even more credible voices to the student, whether those be current students, faculty, whatever, to your point. So I couldn't agree more.
Totally. So that brings us to the question on Twitter of which campus members from the institution's community have the bigger impact on yield, faculty or peers? And then the question being, a follow-up to that is, how can those members get more involved in the process? And I think we'd probably both agree that peer influence is huge, especially at that emotional phase of the process, wanting to feel welcome, feel like it's a good fit, which comes from peer affirmation. But then there's also that fear element that comes from faculty, right? So what are your thoughts on faculty involvement, student involvement in this important process of yield?
Yeah, so I think a lot of that depends on the student, and I think it's typically kind of self-evident that typically higher achieving students coming out of high school tend to be kind of more focused on their academic program choice and probably more interested and more capable of being influenced by a faculty person. Now, that's a bit of a broad generalization. I'd go back and say, really the way to do that well is to make sure you understand what each student's buying motive is. You ask the admissions representative, the counselor, to be managing and make sure they understand what the dominant buying motive is. But if you don't have that data, you can pretty much say that you've got a better chance for your let's say your top 25 to 35% of your admitted population is probably going to be more responsive to faculty contact, academic messaging, than, let's just say, the next 2/3 of your admitted population from an academic quality standpoint, who may be more kind of responsive to making a really good personal connection with a student via any number of kind of communication channels. That becomes really important. And that's why the visit oftentimes is determinative, right? A student comes and they just feel comfortable around the students that they spend time with. They can imagine themselves spending 4 years, 5 years, whatever, on that campus, and they feel like the students that they met are people that they could see as as friends and people that they'd be comfortable being inside and outside the classroom with. So I think it does depend a bit, but I'd probably skew, if you don't have good information on the motives of each of your students, I'd skew high ability strategies to faculty.
Great input.
Skew high ability students to faculty, I meant to say.
Yeah. So we mentioned earlier, right? And I think, for many institutions, it's going to be hard to implement anything that's going to be super, super meaningful in the next 2 weeks that could really make a 3, 4, 5% impact on their overall yield. Maybe 1%, maybe 2%, which, to your point, can be 10, 20, 30 students, depending on the size of the school. But thinking also kind of more strategically about post May 1, right? May 1 is, for many institutions, like mentioned before, is not the finish line. It's a mile marker. You stop, you celebrate where your number is, but then you kind of know how much further you have to go, how much of your class is secured, or if you're behind. So I know when I was at the University of New Haven, I was an associate director of admissions. We would be working all summer to go to running registration and orientations, helping out with placement testing, doing all of those sort of, helping hand off the class while also working in some vacations, working in some conferences, working in prep for the fall, those sorts of things. What are, to the extent that, this is admissions live after all, to the extent that an admissions office can support with that transition, what are some areas where they can really focus on melt alleviation versus yield to deposit, but more so that, deposit to ultimately enrolling number?
Yeah, so I think, to our previous point, everybody's still got a chance to affect MELT, whether you're more of a May 1 place or less of a May 1 place. We can all affect MELT at this juncture. And can you still hear me okay? I just want to make sure. I had a little bit of a change in my...
Nope, you're good.
I'm good? Okay, thanks. So, yeah, I think everyone's got a chance to sort of impact MELT. And I guess the first point, I'll go back to that sort of student decision-making model, which says, they're fairly logical about where they choose to apply, meaning they tend to do that on sort of rational factors like size of scholarship that they might be eligible for, quality of perceived program, location, really kind of rational. This is how I got to my list of places I apply. As I mentioned, their initial decision to enroll for those places that are admitted tends to be a fairly emotional decision. Like it just felt right, it felt comfortable there, et cetera. But the minute they make that decision, and for most young people, this is the biggest decision they're going to make in their life so far, right? They've got big ones coming downstream, career decisions, and sometimes decisions about, life partners and so on. But this is generally the biggest decision they will have made in their life up to this point, particularly for the kind of more traditional out of high school audience. And, I can tell you that we all know when we make a big decision, the first thing that kicks in is cognitive dissonance, where we start saying, was that really a good decision? Because it was a big decision. And did it turn out to be a good one or not so good one? And so when people go through cognitive dissonance, they seek out affirmation for their decision, right? And so I always say it's really critical once they deposit or confirm or register, whatever your confirmation step is, that you have a very planful approach to feeding them both kind of emotional and logical messaging, right? So the emotional messaging needs to keep them connected on an emotional level with campus. So I think things like making sure you're in touch personally about once a month through the summer. I think a great idea that I don't see enough schools do is actually connecting students to their sort of peer advisor who will be their orientation leader or their peer mentor through the first semester of school. Why do we wait till registration or orientation to do that? Why don't we make that connection as soon as they deposit so they've got somebody that they can be connecting with on a personal level at that juncture? And coupling that with messaging that reminds them of why they made the decision to apply and initially confirm in the first place. So again, one of the things that I see often is once a student confirms, deposits, registers, whatever, all the messaging just becomes very transactional. It's about, now's the time to, get your shots and fill out your health forms and, take care of this part of the resident's life situation or whatever. And we lose all the reminder messaging. So think about sending messaging during the summer that reinforce your lead recruiting messages around academic quality, reputation, location, whatever the things that you have been talking to them about from the beginning of the relationship. Don't give up on that messaging during the summer. And then the final point, which I think most folks are on these days, is just making sure that if you've got other campus offices communicating with a student, make sure that the way they're addressing the student, the tone to that student is the same as what they've been accustomed to up to this point. So we can't go from Dear Gil letters for the last 18 months or communications to Dear Incoming Student. That's just going to be a really a pretty substantial disconnect in the mind of the student and can cause, them to have second thoughts about their choice. So I would think about all of that stuff, getting them connected to as many people as possible in a highly personal way during the summer, while also reminding them subtly of the reasons that they, got this far with you in the first place. And we often forget to do that. We often forget to remind them about the things about the school that they found most attractive.
I think I'm going to legally change one of my kids' names to Future Student as their name. And when they start applying to colleges, see how many admissions offices I can think they're going crazy by just having Dear Future Student letters going out, because I think that'd be funny. So one thought that you mentioned on the transactional content, I totally agree that, you go from this rah, we want to see you here type content to here's the forms for Res Life, here's the forms for this, here's the forms for that. And I do believe that that's one of the things that definitely influences MELT, that an institution could make an adjustment now ahead of orientations, ahead of the summer programs that can really make that, an easier process for students, while also moving away from just transactional communications, right? That's something that you could have a meeting with the group and figure out, what are we going to do? I know University of San Diego is a great example of this. They moved a lot of their orientation content online, call it their summer series ahead of pre-enrollment series. So post-deposit, pre-enrollment, before you come to campus, we've got these series of workshops that you need to do. And that way, when they come to campus for the orientation, it's not the boring paperwork stuff. It's more of that transformational, let's feel what it is like on campus type of an experience, versus having to focus on the business elements of all of it, right? Like yes, it's a very expensive proposition, but it's also a personal one and an emotional one. And let's keep it in context for students. This is a really big deal for them. So that's
the other guy I mentioned is just, which is, just jarred my thinking as you talked about that, is just making sure that you have, and you don't want this to be too complicated, but that you understand all the pre-enrollment steps that a student has to take from the point of confirmation / deposit, whatever confirmation is, to enroll, whether that be health forms, housing, things that have to be completed, settling financially, right? Like first bill, and they've made a payment towards that first bill, or set up a payment plan with your business office. So financial settlement is a big deal. Registration, for some places where deposit happens first, the registration happens second, is a key one. But really having a tracking system to be able to monitor which students are checking off those boxes at the appropriate times and who's not, so you can intervene quickly if somebody doesn't seem to be behaving the way that they should be behaving if they're planning to enroll at your school. So think about that. And again, a giant one in there is that financial settlement piece, which I often, again, I was at a place a couple weeks ago, and they were having students show up with over half their class that hadn't paid anything or made any financial arrangements to pay prior to showing up on campus in August. And they were wondering why they had people dropping out in the first semester or in the first 10 days, therefore not even counting on the census numbers, because they just hadn't proactively financially settled with those students during the summer. So I'd be watching that and trying to accelerate that as much as possible to reduce MELT.
Great point. So in the last few minutes that we have, thinking forward even further, right? We've talked about immediate action schools can take. I think a lot of it is personalized content. It's immediate response. It's a good combination of online and offline. Thinking through the summer, it's about having that personal element versus just the transactional content. What about 2020, right? For institutions that are in a position to think more strategically, or know they need to think more strategically. What are some of the things that they can do to start thinking about their 2020 plans to avoid being in a tough spot with respect? I mean, they're going to be in a tough spot anyway. Let's be honest, right? They need to be prepared and taking action. But what can they do now to be on a more solid footing heading into their next campaign?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I mean, one of the things that I like to remind students or schools and enrollment professionals, and it's interesting. I think sometimes we overstate this process and look at it in sort of these discrete stages of decision making. Like first, students figure out where they're going to express interest, like inquire, and then they figure out where they're going to apply. And then obviously there's an admissions or decision, piece in there, as well as a financial aid piece. And then they decide where they're going to go initially with that initial deposit or confirmation. And then they either affirm or don't affirm that decision, right? And we act like all those things happen in discrete steps. And on the one hand, they sort of do. But the truth of the matter is the student decision-making process about where they're going to enroll begins at the moment that they express interest in your school, right? Like the way you are personalizing contact with them at the inquiry stage, or even the pre-applicant stage when maybe they've just sent you test scores, or they've just started to send you a transcript but haven't even applied yet. That college choice spans all those stages, and I think we need to think about it that way and don't think about it so much as discrete steps. So what does that imply? What does that mean? Or what does that imply? I think the first thing it implies is really good strategies to kind of, through modeling and demand management, really constantly be culling your pool to say which of the students that I'm working with an interest in fall 20 or 21 or whatever are most interested in my school. What is most central to their college choice? Is it money? Is it academic program? Is it Greek life? Is it some co-curricular activity, music or whatever, but really starting that sort of customized one-to-one messaging to students, early in the process, once you've got students who are kind of raising their hand and expressing interest. And, I feel like our business has gotten to the point where we're almost starting at the application stage. We don't really manage inquiry pools like we used to. We don't nurture them like we used to. We just sort of try to push people to apply, and then we start to personalize. And I think one of the ways you get a stronger position sort of this time next year is through what I would call hyper personalization to subsets of particularly the inquiry pool or the early applicant pool, depending on your situation. So again, that's modeling, that's good inquiry management, and that's good one-to-one follow-up. And what that means is that then you've got to be engaging students across a whole bunch of different channels, right? And figuring out which of those communication channels, whether that's online events or text messaging or one-on-one email exchanges, or but figuring out what channels the students want to consume information in and what information is most pertinent and relevant to their decision making. So that's what I would encourage schools to think is. To the extent that you still find yourself thinking about managing stages of the process, I would say think about managing the process in terms of the relationship development with the most interested students in your pool from the very moment that they initially express interest.
Awesome. And so we got those are great points, and I could not agree more. And I think I mentioned earlier that, higher ed's really good at layering strategies. We're not necessarily good at taking things away. We're good at adding in additional strategies and shifting some of those things to different places in the funnel, right? And that's fine, right? I think that there's a place for phone, there's a place for email, there's a place for letter, there's a place for webinars, there's a place for campus visit. These things all have influencing factors and influencing opportunities, and it's about layering those strategies on top of each other at the appropriate places versus trying to remove something because you want to add something, right? It's not either or, it's and when it comes to these types of things, right? With that in mind,
I would go back just one more. I go back one more time and say, making sure that we're communicating what the student wants and needs in the channel of communication that they're most comfortable and prefer. And I think we still force feed information way too much in the industry, and we need to be way more responsive to the students, like making sure we understand what they want to be talking about and hearing about, and making sure we're respecting the best channel to communicate with them. And we have lots of communication channels at our disposal today that we didn't when I certainly got into this business, where we had a telephone and a gas card, and those were our basic and the ability to see people on campus. Those are our basic communication, and direct mail. And those were our basic ways we could reach a household. And so we've got so many more ways to reach a household now, but we need to respect the ways that the student's most comfortable, consuming that information from us.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And to that point, one of the channels is social media, right? And we got a question on the Higher Ed Live hashtag, from an admissions social media standpoint. Is there any specific strategies on the specific networks to help admitted students commit? I think from my perspective, I've been researching and presenting on social media for a few years. I love your thoughts too, but what I'll kind of infuse there is, in one way, social media is the largest advertising platform that has been built, right? So one is, how are you integrating sponsored content, digital media, whether it's with custom audiences or geofencing or other methods for trying to reach and engage your students? That's the push marketing way. But then, of course, there's the pull marketing way, which is being responsive when they're mentioning you, when they're commenting on you. So it's less about trying to snoop out students on multiple social media channels, and it's more about being available and responsive. I think when Facebook and Twitter and all came out earlier, a number of years ago, the concern was, we're going to lose control of the conversation if we have a presence on social media. We can't control it, and it's gone beyond that, where it's you don't have control over the conversation. You can just hope to be a positive member of the conversation, providing those answers and providing responses when a student has those questions. So a good solid listening strategy with social. So it's not about a singular platform, but it's, to your point, multi-channel, multi-touch is going to have a bigger impact. So you can't be on necessarily one. You have to be available on all, but also thinking about the investment of effort and finances is there's the sponsored content piece, the digital marketing piece, which is more awareness building and top of the funnel type activity, to then bottom of the funnel, having that visibility and awareness as well. So even things like streaming, right? Like we're streaming this episode of Higher Ed Live on Twitter, right? What is your streaming strategy, which is social media, right? With Facebook Live and Twitter Live and YouTube Live, you've got that opportunity now to be more engaging than just here's a picture of a beautiful building on campus and hoping you get a bunch of likes, right? So it's about creating that content that's worth sharing, that's worth engaging with, would be the recommendation, which might not answer the question directly, but hopefully that, I don't know if you have anything else you want to add to the social media piece there.
No, I totally agree with everything you've said. And one of the things I would say is, there are wonderful resources on ruffalonl.com. Our e-expectations report, or you can just Google e-expectations, has been in the field for going on 2 decades now. It does a wonderful job of documenting sort of the changing platforms that students are using and sort of when they want to engage. But there, in some ways, there hasn't been as much movement there as you might think. But I would point the audience to go just download that most recent report, and I think you'll find everything you want to know about sort of channel preferences in social media. And then to your point, Gil, I think the notion of really feeding really good custom content is critical. And we do know, by the way, that research has continued to show time and time again that students are more willing to engage meaningfully, at least in two-way dialogue and social media, kind of once they apply, and maybe what I would call late inquiry stage, when they're pretty qualified, is pretty interested, or when they've kind of mentally made the decision to apply for admission, even if they haven't done that yet. In other words, it seems a little more challenging to get them to engage meaningfully in social media kind of at the prospect and inquiry stage is our experience. Yeah. And the research continues to show that. So if you had to, pick where to invest time and energy on that, I'd invest in trying to get my students engaged once they've applied, or once that they're a highly interested inquiry. So
yep.
I don't know if that helps,
and I would just add that this conversation is focused on student engagement, because I can imagine we're at our time for today, but imagine we could have a whole separate conversation about parent engagement and how Facebook is an older population now and more engaging, and so streaming on Facebook might have different results. But that's a whole different can of worms, and we can hold that for next time. Kevin, appreciate
we even talk about parents and yield, and certainly parents and melt. They should be a critical part of both those campaigns. So that would be a topic we could also talk about later. So, but I know we're short of time here. So
absolutely, yeah. So thank you so much. We'll talk to Higher Ed Live about a sequel episode in the future at some point. But Kevin, appreciate all of your insights, all of your thoughts, and taking the time today. We really appreciate it. And thanks again to everyone who's participating in the conversation. Let's keep it going on #HigherEdLive on Twitter. And as always, thank you to our program sponsors, M. Stoner, for making this possible as well. Thank you, everybody. Have a great day.